Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at using the MyLittleGrid custom grid without the use of either SQL Tools or SQL Server to speed up your application development. This was our application at the end of the last video. For those of you that haven't watched the previous 4 videos in this series, I'll give a quick summary of what we've done so far. We have a PowerBasic Windows application which is using a MyLittleGrid control. This control is displaying data from a series of flat text files. Each of these text files is actually emulating a SQL Server stored procedure. The initial idea in developing these libraries was to use MyLittleGrid as a front end to a SQL Server database. However, in doing that, we're using a paid application called SQL Tools, which I can highly recommend. However, for those of you who have not yet purchased SQL Tools, I've added an extra library to allow us to simulate what's happening inside the SQL Server database by using the flat text files. This is a list of 2,000 records displayed in our grid. Our grid has 2 tabs, a main data tab containing all the names and job titles of the staff within our fictional company, and a departments tab which will allow us to see the departments that exist within this fictional company. In our previous videos, we set the grid up so that it would allow you to make changes. Any change made to the grid is highlighted in green until the Save Changes button on the toolbar is clicked, at which point the information is saved back to the flat text files. We can also sort each individual column, and we can change the value in the department column by use of a drop-down. On the surname column, we provided a user button, which can be used to drill down to anything you want within your application. What we're going to be doing today is adding some search fields above the main grid to allow you to search the content of the data by keying in the value from either the forename or the surname fields. So let's have a look at the code. At the beginning of the code, where we include all the libraries, we have the standard Windows libraries, we have the library for MyLittleGrid. If you are using SQL Tools, you can comment back in this line of code. This will allow you to use SQL Tools directly. However, for today's video, we're just going to be using the flat text files. So we'll be using the PB generic CDF functions library. So if we have a look at the form, at the moment, the form is quite empty, as the toolbar is put onto the form outside the PB forms code, and the grid is also done that way. What we're going to add are 2 fields. So firstly a surname field, and then a forename field. And having added both of those fields, we'll save the form and go back into our editor. And if we run our application now, we will see that 2 new fields appear above the grid. We're going to use these to put in criteria to search the grid. So we'll also need a search button which the user can click on once they've filled in these fields. So we now have our search button in place. So we're now going to put the code behind these new Windows objects to allow us to search the grid. So we have a look at the callback function, which is our event handler. If we scroll down here to look at the code that handles the dialog, we will find there is a new event which has been created to allow us to click on the button and to put some code in. So we'll remove the message box that's been put in automatically, and we're going to be putting some code in here. However, before we do that, we'll create some new local variables to our callback function that will allow us to keep track of what the users put into these fields. At the beginning of our callback function, there is an initialized dialog event. This triggers when the form is about to be shown to the user. We're using this event to actually trigger the population of the grid, and we're calling what is an effect to store procedures if we were talking to a SQL database. In this case, they are being populated using the generic populate grid function in our library. Depending on which libraries you've either commented in or commented out at the beginning of the code, you're either going to be talking to a SQL Server database or the flat text files. The underlying code is exactly the same. So we have one call to populate the user list, and we have one call to populate the department list. Now, since the user is going to be keying in either a surname or a forename, or perhaps both, we're going to be effectively requerying the database or flat text file to get that information back, based on the criteria the user has actually keyed in. So let's have a look at the event when the search button is actually triggered. So now we've found the click event for the button. The user, of course, could have been making changes to our grid already, and the first thing we'll need to do is to check that there are no changes on the grid that have not yet been saved. So we're going to use a piece of code we've used previously, and this is the count changes function. This will count however many changes have been made to the currently selected grid. And if this number is greater than 0, then we warn the user using a message box that there are indeed unsaved changes on the worksheet, and prompt them to save this before they continue. And at that point, we actually exit from this function. So if we get past this piece of code, there are no changes to save. Of course, since we have two sheets, two tabs on the grid, it's quite possible the user could be on either one. The user could indeed be on either the data or the departments one. Now, since the surname and forename all exist on the data one, we want to search on the data tab. So how do we know which tab the user is actually on at any point in time? Now, there is an event which has been triggered every time the user changes tab. But there's also a function we can use in one of our libraries which will allow us to work out which tab the user is actually on. And this can be done by either the sheet number or the name. And this function is getSelectedTabName. It takes two parameters, the first being the grid handle, and the second is an output parameter which will return the actual slot number. For example, in this case, either slot number 1 or slot number 2. The return from the function is a string, and this is the name that is displayed to the user of the tab. As we have two tabs, the one we're interested in is data. So we're putting a conditional in here to make sure this piece of code will only run if the currently selected tab is the data tab. Since the data we want to get back is the user list table, if we're using SQL Server, we'll be calling the store procedure to get the user list. And we'll use exactly the same piece of code to get it back from our flat text file. The next thing we want to determine is, has the user actually keyed in the surname or the forename or both? So we'll use a simple control get text command on both the text name and the forename fields, populating the str surname and str forename variables. So if the user has effectively not populated either the surname or the forename, then we want to get everything back on the grid. Now that's exactly a duplicate piece of code to what we put into our initialize dialog. So we're using the generic populate grid routine to populate it based on the information we have. We're going to give it the form name, the grid name, the tab name, the SQL, which is telling it where to get the information, the grid handle, and the handle for the database. In this case, we're taking all our data from the flat text file. So this allows the user to requery the database and get all the information back. However, if the surname or the forename has been populated, we want to query the database and get only the information the user has asked for coming back. Now, in many cases, in a SQL Server database, you would do this by running a different query, a query with parameters. However, to minimize coding, there's another function in our libraries we can make use of. We're going to set our search criteria into this search criteria variable. And this has got 3 parameters. It will have the name of the field we wish to query, the value we're looking for in that, and a third and final variable is the wildcard flag. This will allow us to either do an exact match on the data we're looking for, or a case-independent fuzzy search. So let's set those variables up. So we'll be setting the wildcard to 1, which means 2 things. First of all, it's a case-independent search, and secondly, it's a fuzzy search. The case-independent search will mean that it doesn't matter whether the user keys uppercase or lowercase letters in either of the fields. The fuzzy search means that whatever the user keys into either of the fields, it will be looked for to see if the string they've keyed in is forming a part of the field they're looking for it in. This will make more sense when we actually run the code. So the first thing to determine is the surname field populated or not. So we're populating the search criteria. First we're giving it the name of the column we wish to search, the value in that column we're looking for, and the wildcard if there is one. So having set up these search criteria, we need to call a new function called generic populate grid ex. This is an extended version of the generic populate grid function. This takes an additional parameter, which is our search criteria. And this goes away, gets the data from wherever it comes from, formats it onto the grid, and only populates it if the search criteria is a match. So let's try running that code now. So there is a grid on the screen. So if we're looking for one of these entries, if we copy one of the values, paste it into the surname field, and click Search. So it's now returned two records, those which match what we're looking for, as in Winters as being the surname. If we keyed it in lowercase, and only keyed part of the name, it would still find the same two records. Now we also want to put something in that highlights that we've returned just the two records, and not the 2000 we did originally. So let's add that to our code. So after we've done the generic populate grid ex, we want to update the label on the screen that says how many records we've actually returned. And we can use a piece of code we did earlier, which is using the getRowsInGrid function. And since we've done that, we want to set the toolbar state to ensure it's marked that nothing has been updated. So if we run that now, and we key in winter again, and hit the search button, it will return two records, and there they are. So how do we add on the forename as an additional parameter to our search criteria? In here we populated the initial search criteria. We now want to add to that. So we need to test to see whether the forename field has been populated or not. So we merely need to test to make sure that the forename parameter has actually been populated. If so, we're adding to the search criteria what was already there plus the field we want to query, the value we're looking for, and the wildcard. And again, as you can see here, it would be quite possible to search for wildcards where the value is 1 or wildcards where the value is 0, all within the same query. And the rest of the code doesn't have to change. So you could add on a number of search criteria into the one search. So if we try running this now, and we look for example, someone with the surname of Bolton, and we search that out, and if we're looking just for the first name, this should return only one record, which it does. If we take the amber out again, do a search, it will return the 3, and if we take everything out to leave neither surname or forename, it will return all the records. Now in our grid configuration, it's quite possible that the name that user gets to see as the heading of each column is not necessarily how it is inside the file. For those of you who watched the previous videos, you'll know how we're going to do this. In our code folder, we have a cdef-config.exe, and this allows us to configure our application in the grid. So if we look at the MLG demo, which is the program we're configuring, the main form, the first grid, and we're looking for the data tab. If we search out the details on that, we can see each of the columns which is referred to in the grid. And the user gets to see the forename column headed as forename. But the information in the database, or the flat text file in this case, is called first name. all the references in the code will be to the result name values, and what the user gets to see can be changed. So if at some point in the future your user wishes to change the name of the department column, we can do that quite easily by just changing the column name, leaving the result name exactly the same, and if all your code's referring to the result name, then there is no coding change required at all. You merely have to save this back to the config file, and the next time the application runs, it will pick up the new configuration. This is why in our code we refer to first name rather than forename. As in here. So with the fuzzy search turned on, you can search for part of a name and it will find that part and display all the records. For example, we're looking for TON, so anything with TON anywhere in it, whether it's the beginning, the middle, or the end of the word, it will find it quite happily. So today we have quite successfully added 2 search fields to our application with a minimum of coding change. Hopefully you will find that useful, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.